have a professor friend who said to me one time, never teach anything you don't really love. I don't love terrorism, obviously, but I love the way people communicate, particularly through the journalistic media. And some of my best friends in some of the most desperate conflict zones I've been in the world, in the Middle East and in Southern Africa, were journalists who I trusted with my life. And sometimes they trusted me with their lives as we traveled in places like Gaza, like the inner cities of Southern Africa, and so on. And so I'm very, very happy to be with you today. I'm grateful for the opportunity that Dr. Samir and your dean have given me. And I want you to know that you may be studying this subject in what we call in philosophy a kairos time, a pivot time. And what I'd like us to do as we start today, get everybody's juices flowing, is turn to the person next to you and for 1 minute, quickly exchange in a phrase each on what you think the challenge to journalism has been in the last 6 months. Something you've seen that causes you to question what's happening in the United States, particularly in terms of media, in terms of governance, in terms of interpretation. So think for a minute, turn to the person next to you or move over to the person next to you and answer the question to one another, what has been my biggest concern about what I've seen in the press or about the press in the last 6 months? Can you do that quickly? You're kind of whispering, but let's have that conversation. All right, thanks very much. Thanks very much. I'd love to have been privy to each of those conversations because I'll bet you that it overlaps with what I want to share with you today. What I would like to do is give you an assumption for your consideration. And that assumption is that maybe terrorism isn't the most important war we're fighting. From a humanitarian point of view, it's my assumption that terrorism is not the most important war we're fighting. And what is the possible participation of people in public life in obscuring what the proper war is? So that's my assumption. My process is I'm going to share a PowerPoint with you about some of the needs in the world. Some of the things that in my lifetime career, 40 years, I've had to deal with legislatively, I've had to deal with in terms of advocacy, I've had and gotten to deal with personally with people in some of the worst need in the world. And then at the end, I'd like you to feel very free to ask hard questions, to practice the journalistic skill of asking hard questions about things that may puzzle you a bit. So, journalism, in my view, is a time of choice. Not only are you choosing, as first or second year students at a university, what your career is going to be and whether you're going to choose journalism, But it's also a time of choice in a time when there's erosion in the stability of governance, in public life, where the U.S. is losing a functional identity in the world, a confused identity in the world, where basic institutions are challenged, public education, religion, you name it. You've seen it. The media has been questioned from the highest levels. Energizing by being maligned. People are energizing themselves by being maligned and using fear and anger and fake facts. It's a time of immense importance in terms of choice, in terms of political choice, where our public leaders, whether at the local level, at the highest level, at the international level, have to be held accountable. And of course, journalists are key to that. It's a time of immense importance. It really is. I can't emphasize that enough. You're fortunate to be in a learning setting during this time. I love what M.L. King said, that our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. So really, what you are engaged with in your own personal journey right now, I would even call it a pilgrimage, is deciding what it is that you are willing to speak up about that really matters to you. This is hard to understand at first glance. You can look at it when it's on the film. But this is from a man named James Rossinow. He's a political scientist at Princeton University. He's written a book called Turbulence in World Politics. And he says that the state-centric world after the Second World War is coming undone. It's not just two big superpowers that gather allies. But in the post-war era, industrial change, the microelectronic change, digital, the world is changing faster than we can keep track of, especially for older people like me to adjust to. The microchips are now able to double their capacity every 2 years. Used to be that a tennis court size computer had to hold the information on one subject that people were looking at, like DNA research. Today it can be on a tiny chip that's in your PlayStation, on your TV. That's mind-blowing. In the year 2006, 2007, there were more changes. It was like the Gutenberg Bible period of digital world. So many things were invented that year. You can name some of them. Do you know what happened in 2006, 2007? It was kind of obscured because of the collapse of the economy in 2008. But what are some of the things that were invented or created and started in 2007, 6 and 7? Anybody know? Facebook? The Watkins computer? What else? Say it again. Smartphone, iPhones. There are about 10 or 12 things like that that were started 2006, 2007. Changed our lives, changed the world, just like the printing of the Bible changed how people understood the printed word. So that's the sort of experience we're having. To adjust to that is mind-boggling because it's now doubling every 2 years, these kinds of technologies. It used to cost millions of dollars to isolate DNA and do the genetic mapping that is being done today. Now it can be done for $1,000 per person. In another couple years, it's going to be half that. Very important book for you to write down is this book, Thank You for Being Late by Thomas Friedman. He talks about this digital microelectronic change. A new book. You can even hear him précis the book online by going to Brookings, and pulling up his name, and you can, in an hour, understand the book. But Rossinow says that started because of the use of computers in the Second World War. And so what happened, that there were centralizing dynamics, but there were also decentralizing dynamics. And the state-centric world began to come apart around the Third World. That's why humanitarian action was so important. And what then happened was that the advent of new transnational issues like pollution, terrorism, drugs, illnesses like AIDS, caused an expanded analytical capacity among individual people, not just governments. And the states' reduced capacity caused the weakened whole systems. This system really disintegrated. And the state-centric world and the multi-centric world have gone on parallel paths. What's going to happen in this 21st century, in the third millennium, is beyond any of our imaginations. So, again, I say, what a wonderful time to be in the position you're in. One of my best advisors when I was working for the UN and for the NGOs in Geneva, Switzerland, was a man named Michel Vette. And he was the head of the International Committee of the Red Cross Training Center in San Remo, Italy. And he said that humanitarian partnerships are like a rainbow. All of life is like a rainbow. And different ones of us are involved in the different colors. The red stands for Red Cross, blood, war, the heart. I would say the heart not only physically, but emotionally, spiritually. The orange has to do with rebuilding, with development. The organization I worked for, even before this rainbow was created and passed around, used the color orange. People have seen orange as being a color that is indicative of humanitarian development. Yellow is obviously light, but it also stands for civil society. Green, the Green Revolution, environment, also economy. Blue is obviously the UN, but it's water and the sky. Indigo, law, human rights, journalism. Violet, spiritual, church, mosque, synagogue, whatever your spiritual root system is, what your base camp is. And then this is really interesting. If you probably know this from freshman physics in high school. What happens if you don't have all the colors of the rainbow? What happens when you have all colors of the rainbow? Speak up, anybody? You have clear light. You have white. If you don't have all the colors of the rainbow, it begins to go gray. And finally, it goes black. It goes dark. If you don't have all the colors of the rainbow, then you don't have community. So each of us decide according to our interests, our skills, our gifts, where we fit in the humanitarian rainbow. That's part of the fun of being in a time of upheaval and chaos. I had a friend named Sergio who was the head of UNHCR in Geneva. He was the man, when you were probably in grade school, was killed in the Baghdad bombing, a terrorist bombing. And he was one of the most popular executives in the UN. And every time he was with me, or in a small group, or in a group of 1,000, he would conclude his presence with us by saying, "Be a presence. and be it in the company of others. And even in his dying moments, the friend whose hand he was holding while he was hanging upside down in that UN headquarters in Baghdad, he said that to his friend. It's a mantra that is good for all of us to remember. How do we avoid too close identification then with the political systems and the military systems? Excuse me. How do we do what Sergio said without embedding ourselves so deeply with politics or with military or with anything that would preclude our doing what that calling would indicate for us? What are the benchmarks to work in a conflict zone? That's really what I'm talking about. What did I have to think about as I was driving journalists into Gaza when Gaza was under siege? What did I have to think about when I was escorted by journalists into the townships in South Africa during the terrible violence there? Is humanitarian action a substitute for unclear political or military interventions? You sometimes see journalist colleagues traveling in convoys in war zones. You see journalists fully armored with helmets and vests and everything else. How are they not then becoming representative of the military or the violent action with the units they're with? And sometimes they're with terrorist organizations. They're not just with U.S. or UN organizations. Does a hostile environment drive us back to the drawing board? That's one of the things that's confused things in the last 6 months. Somebody may have mentioned that in your conversation. Why are media and humanitarians facing intense hostility today? Why are we now being targeted? I've been shot at, or I've had people killed on either side of me in violent situations. If you end up as a representative of a media outlet someplace in the broken world, you may likely see terrible things right next to you. There are hundreds of journalists that die in the course of several years because they risk going into difficult situations so the world can know the truth. This was written by another friend in the UN, Dennis McNamara. So here we have a paradox, don't we? We have terror on one hand, and we have terrible human need on the other hand. Take a moment to read that. What's the war against terror? What's the war against hunger? Is every alleged terrorist an enemy of the United States? It's become our highest priority if you listen to our politicians speak. Should it be? The war against hunger has been the highest priority for the UN in the last almost 20 years. Almost concurrent with the 9/11 attack was the appeal by the UN for the Millennium Development Goals. Tuck that away, the Millennium Development Goals. It's a very important thing to know about. Billions of people across the globe live in squalid conditions of hunger and desperation. The pandemic of poverty is important to comprehend. While both wars have been widely reported in the media, the paradox of relationship between these wars has been ignored. I would challenge you as aspiring journalists, or even if you never become journalists, but just active in civil society, what's the relationship? One can't be one without the other. I propose that the war on hunger is a pivot point for the war on terror. They are so inextricably linked that most people have failed to see its importance. Okay, so how do we keep terrorism in perspective? We have to stop looking at terrorism as if it's leading us to the end of the world. But the rest of us have a duty to ourselves and the equilibrium in our countries to keep it in perspective. Before bin Laden, in the late 1990s, there was a decline in terrorism. Until recently, that had been the direction of things. Less and less terrorism. So we have a cause and effect situation. 1.3 billion people have no clean water. Did you know that? It's huge. If you want to research water more, there's a sheet on the table here with a lot of contacts, computer contacts that you can look at. 3 billion people have no access to sanitation. 25% of the world population has no electricity. There are 60 million refugees. That's the most since the Second World War. And IDPs in the world, displaced persons. Think of Syria. Half their population, nearly 3 million people, are displaced or refugees. Some of them were turned away at the airport last week. Living in camps like this or in much more squalid camps. But 20% of the world's population consumes 86% of the resources, and that includes people like us. As careful as we are the great consumers. We consume as though it's our life's work. In 10 years, at the current rate of consumption, 3 billion people will suffer from lack of water. There's been a recent report, it's listed on this paper, you can look at it, that millions of people in the United States are going to suffer what Flint, Michigan did and not have potable water. How can that be in the United States? How can that be here in the Mississippi Delta when there's so much water? Don't have to think too much about it, about how it's going to happen. Not only from overuse, but wrong kinds of use or lack of clean water because of the different kinds of pollution. An African farmer uses 10 liters of water per day. I've seen the people carrying the buckets on their heads. That's all they can carry from a distant well, even though they may live in water. Water everywhere and nothing to drink. A European farmer uses 250 to 350 liters a day. An American farmer uses, and you can see the sprinklers all over this area and all over the United States, 600 liters of water per day. In Gaza, where I worked feverishly to get potable water to people, to 2 million people. Most of the water projects I put in, both in Gaza and the West Bank, even though I recorded them with the military, I recorded them with the public services, most of those were destroyed through war or hostile acts. Now 95% of the people in Gaza do not have potable water. Liver and kidney diseases are rampant. Children are shriveled. Many, many people have to spend half their income on bottled water. A lot of it is because of restrictions. The occupying government won't let them have clean water or sell it at a high price, or because of occupation, and humanitarian agencies aren't allowed to dig new wells. The recharge is impossible close to an ocean because of the high draw on water. Seawater intrudes in the aquifers as they shrink. The sewage systems have been blown up, and ironically, the people that have blown up the sewage system are suffering the damage from the sewage as the water flows north on the Mediterranean toward Israel and Lebanon. And there's no solid waste disposal. That's terrible for 2 million people, half of them children. What's the responsibility of people like us who care? So here's what's here on the table if you want it, the Global Water Partnership. I know some people here at the university are doing research on this. You may end up in some of those protocols. Then there's the food issue. 365 kilograms of cereal per person are produced in the world, enough for everybody. There's enough food in the world for everybody. People don't have to go hungry. But 40,000 people a day die of hunger-related illnesses. Did you know that? Think of that. 40,000 people a day. 795 million people do not have enough food for a healthy life. In developing countries, 12.9% of the population is undernourished. 1 in 4 in Africa. Still, I'm seeing distended bellies in Africa. Asia has the most hungry, 2/3 of the total. Poor nutrition, and 45% of the children cause their deaths. 66 million primary children attend class hungry. Can you imagine how it'd be to sit through classes today and you hadn't had any food? You get no breakfast, you get no lunch. Maybe at dinner when you get home there'll be a small a couple spoonsful of rice or some sort of mash. $3.2 billion a year is needed to reach school-age children to reduce undernourishment and early death. Hunger could be reduced by 150 million people if women farmers were better resourced. That's as recently as 2015 from the World Food Program. I had a professional colleague by the name of Reuven Gall when I was in Israel and Palestine. Reuven was the psychiatric consultant to the Israeli Defense Force. He became a real confidant to me, and we shared compassionate concerns for people on both sides of the conflict. And he said, over a coffee one day when he was struggling with trauma in his own life because he had seen so much terrible in the lives of the soldiers he was responsible for, he said that there are 3 things that cause trauma and cause hostility from one person to another, or one culture to another. He said, Jewish people have a lot of reasons to be angry. My root system is, I have a Hebrew name. I come from Jewish grandparentage. He said, Jewish people have a lot of reason to be angry because of the Holocaust, because of persecution through the centuries, because of misunderstanding from the church, etc., etc. And he said the second thing people have that causes trauma in their lives is fear that it's going to happen again. This is applicable to people who have suffered terrorist acts. So you have anger, you have fear, and then if you have ignorance of the other, if the person that's your perceived enemy you don't know personally, they're behind a wall, you can imagine that they're worse than they really are, or they're inherently bad people. We've been through this in our own country the way we've treated one another. If you have those three characteristics, it results in hostility directed toward the other that you rationalize, and you can do anything. Dr. Samir's family suffered this in the Middle East. The people I worked with suffered it in the Middle East, now worse than ever, and in southern Africa. People in Ireland suffered this. People in Germany carry the trauma of this still today because of what their parents or grandparents did. That's the psychology of xenophobia. It's a very important thing to understand. He's retired his commission because he was getting traumatized from hearing the stories from soldiers, mainly because of what they did to women and children, and has started a free medical clinic near Haifa called the Carmel Institute. 6% of the world's population owns 60% of the world's wealth, and another 94% are in debt personally or through government to the wealthy 6%. That's an illustration of how the other are treated. Things are only getting worse. Trend lines hold. The GDP per person is getting worse and worse in Asia and the Pacific. Life expectancy at birth in years is going down. It's even going down in the United States, dear friends. With nearly half the world struggling to live on $2 a day and 87% of the world's teenagers in developing countries, the violent reaction from those oppressed and poor is understandable, eh? Now you begin to see the linkage. People packed in like this and denied the Maslow basics, no wonder they strike out. Maslow teaches that people will do anything to meet basic needs of food, shelter, and safety from predators, or people that are perceived to be predators. Nations who lead war on terror create more terrorists by exploitation and occupation of the weaker. This is the paradox. The exclamation points show in yellow up at the top that 190,000 people have died from acts of terror in the last 10 years. Now, it's sad for the 190,000 and their families. But deaths by preventable starvation worldwide since 2006, that's how many it is. Startling. $6,500 Africans die every day of treatable, preventable disease for want of medicines you and I can get at the local drugstore. That is not a cause, it's an emergency. It's not about charity, but it's about justice. We are good at charity, but justice is a tougher standard. And that's what we're faced with as people who write and communicate. How do we instill in people's lives the biblical call to justice? To care for the poor and the oppressed and the fatherless. To release the prisoners. To care for the blind and the sick. Africa makes a fool out of our ideas of justice. Asia even worse, farce of an idea of equality. It is bursting into flames and we need fire brigades. That's the first tough truth. The second is to fight AIDS and the other illnesses. At its root, cause extreme poverty is not just a development policy, it's a security policy. We are faced with security questions that are not surfaced. And trade is a badge of shame. Not the World Bank or the World Trade Organization, but it's governments. And it's going to cost. It's not going to be cheap. Expensive, hard choices. And our leaders in this country, and our political debates in this country, don't get at this. We are the first generation, you are the first generation, that can look extreme, stupid poverty in the eye and say this, and I mean it. Do we have the will to make poverty history? I say we can't afford not to. Bono said that. One of our prophets. What's the guy in the corner with, the prophet on the corner with a signboard usually have on his sign? What's it say? You seen it? You seen the signboards that sometimes are in cartoons? Repent, the end is near. Now, it might be a good message after hearing this, but this is really the way. The end isn't near. We have got to learn to cope. We have got to learn to cope as people who see themselves as the minority of one bound in the rainbow. People who can have tremendous impact. The Women's March that was 2 weeks ago, where millions of people all over the world marched for basic human rights, that was started by one person in Hawaii who emailed a friend. That's the power of the internet. It's the power of one person's conviction. Some of you, I guarantee it, will be in a position to make that kind of action. There are some things that are self-apparent. Immutable laws of creation. We risk becoming irrelevant if we ignore or refuse to speak about the violations. South Africa is a good illustration. South Africa is ready to go up in smoke because a white man killed one of the most important leaders, a man who would have been president after Mandela. And the rage was just horrific. I was there. I felt it. I knew that maybe the end was near in South Africa's experiment with democracy. And Nelson Mandela went on nationwide television, and he told about a white woman that read the license plate of the man that had killed the black leader, Steve Biko, and reported it. And the guys were arrested, and unlike some of the killers in this state, were incarcerated. One person made that difference. One person who made the telephone call, one person who spoke to the nation. It was called a miracle? It wasn't a miracle. It was people doing what they could do. One person and a lot of people with sheer hard work. This doesn't have to be unique to South Africa. I loved being there. I loved it because I saw this, quote, miracle happen. I have 4 South African grandsons. It means a lot to me that that country makes it, that in the next round they get a good president. But it inspired me to know that no matter how desperate the challenges, you, I, the people we're close to can make a difference. Life is a journey. One has to walk toward the light. Take this step, perform this act, you will be astonished to feel that the effort accomplished, instead of having exhausted your strength, has doubled it, and that you already see more clearly what you have to do next. Thank you for the privilege of presenting this to you. I'd be very happy to take any of your questions. Thank you.
I'll ask you the first.
Okay, Dr. Samir. Not too hard, and not in Arabic, okay? I'm a little rusty.
So, بعد ما حكيت هلا هيك. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the
My
privilege.
question to you, in this age of alternative facts,
Yep.
how can we make sure that the facts that you presented us are facts, not alternative facts?
Well, for one thing, I've given you reference points. You're going to get this film. You can check out some of the things I said. You can go deeper. Some of it's approximation. When you see exclamation points like that, I put 5 exclamation points up at 40,000 persons. Each exclamation point, that's 200,000 rather than 190,000. So there are little details like that that are facts that are important. But I told you no lies in this presentation. Lies are lies, facts are facts. And God has given us the capacity to know both intuitively and by our rational seeking what is truth and what isn't truth. And if we get into a situation where we're trying to evangelize people about something like I am with you today, and we don't tell the truth, then my authority is limited. My authority is diminished. But all these things I put here are UN statistics, are appropriate statistics from people who really care, and they may not be actually perfectly spot on, but they tell the truth about the situation. And now in our public life, sometimes people are reporting things with misunderstandings built in, knowing that they're not true, to try and persuade to a political point of view or another. And again, what's happening, and I think it's a wonderful thing, people are holding people accountable like never before. If somebody tells an untruth, like how many people appeared at an inauguration, the next day photos go up, appropriate counts go up, and people are held accountable. I think probably one of the blessings of the digital revolution is that we can check things almost immediately, and get authoritative information that will help us understand.
So you mentioned that we have a paradox, the war on terror and the war on hunger.
Right.
Whose responsibility is it the government or is it the media to shed the light on the war of hunger the same way they shed the light on the war of terror?
One of the things you'll find if you open the book or see the film about Tom Friedman is that he really believes that governance today is not from governors, mayors, presidents, kings, parliaments, congresses. Did I repeat one of those things? He believes it's not from on high, it's from grassroots. It's from families. It's from community groups. It's from churches, synagogues, mosques. It's from the basic structure of our society. He comes from a little town called 4,000 people in Minnesota, one of the lake towns in Minnesota. And when Minnesota had the good humor, I think, but it was also a stupid mistake, to elect a professional wrestler as the governor of the state, Jesse Ventura. 10 executives from the top companies, Honeywell and Microsoft and those companies, got together for a lunch every Friday to make decisions together about how to take responsibility for education, for safety, for care in their community, for the elderly, for the orphans. And those 10 guys, or their successors, are still meeting today every Friday to decide how to govern their town of 4,000 people. That's an amazing story. He highlights it. It's a whole chapter in his book. It's I'm from Minnesota, and it's been a wonderful thing to see. They believe it's their responsibility to halt the war on terror by caring for their people. Halt the violence against one another, Native Americans, Hmong refugees, Somali refugees, people of color, all the people in their community they've invited to live there. They've been one of the biggest sponsors of refugees in the country. They believe it's their responsibility to put those two together.
Go ahead.
Speak up, please.
So, I have a question about Israel.
Yeah.
And so, I'd just like to preface
Yeah.
And it's by saying, given the International Court of Justice's ruling that Israel is in clear violation of international law in 2004, and multiple UN General Assembly resolutions such as Resolution 39146
Yeah.
and 45 United Nations Human Rights Council resolutions condemning Israel, which is significantly more than any other nation. What is your stance on U.S. funding for Israel?
Getting down to it.
I promise I didn't put them up.
Well, let me put it in a larger context. Do you know how much the United States gives in foreign assistance to needy countries?
I don't remember the exact numbers, but I know that it's an overwhelming majority goes to Israel. I can find the site for that if you would like.
You can, but I can tell you an approximation.
Okay.
It's not a alt fact. It depends on the year. The foreign assistance budget is $6 to $7 billion for the whole world. When a country gives a country that is one of the largest, for a tiny state, one of the largest economies in the world, seventh maybe? Israel, for its population, has a huge burgeoning economy. When one country, whether it's the United States or Britain or somebody else, gives $3 billion, and it's just been increased in the last administration, $3 billion a year to one country, I would say that's probably an inequality that we should speak to. No matter what you think about the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, Jews and Arabs, that just on the face of it doesn't make any sense. And it's a leftover from the Camp David talks and so on, where we said we would provide security for the region. But that's the point. Does this provide security? When I talk to members of Congress about it, many are deeply troubled by the fact that pouring that kind of weaponry into a country, a lot of it old American weaponry or new weaponry that we want to test, it just fans the flames. And the people who are really hungry and suffering and don't have clean water don't get any of it. Partly because those of us in the humanitarian community have to get the crumbs from under the table to do the wells, repair the Roman waterworks, deliver the food, care for the sick, pay for the hospitals that have been destroyed in fighting. So my attitude is that I have compassion for my Jewish brothers and sisters and relatives in the Gilo settlement, but on the face of it, they're digging their own hole by using resources like that in one way that should be used in another, that will stifle, that will curtail the violence that people feel against them. Does that answer your question?
To a point.
I wish it wasn't like that. That kind of inequality is not good for our reputation. It's not good for Israel, particularly since it's got the Buy America tag attached to it. They have to spend that money to buy American weapons, which is another huge issue.
I mean, that's being phased out right now. That was part of the $38 billion deal over 10 years.
You're right, but it's still a lot.
Sure, but also isn't it even funding it, that's in violation of our own national laws?
It's against the Leahy Amendment because the Leahy Amendment says no military weaponry that we make available can be used against civilians. And that's the violation of international humanitarian law that's got people so upset. Here's another question. Stand up so I can hear you.
I noticed on one of the slides you had the country that occupies a terrorist country makes terrorism worse. I was wondering what you meant by that.
Say it again.
I noticed on one of the slides you had that a country that's terrorist being occupied by another country makes the terrorism worse.
Yes.
I was wondering what you meant by that.
How else can I say it? What I saw with my own eyes is when there is a cruel occupation of a people illegally, where land is taken by one country, and they don't take care of the people that under international humanitarian law they're supposed to do. The Geneva Conventions require an occupying country to meet the needs of the people they occupy. And if that isn't done, then I don't like it when my friends who are occupied, whether it's in South Africa or Ireland or the West Bank, rise up and use force. I encourage a nonviolent approach rather than a violent approach. It's worked better over the years to do nonviolence. Gandhi taught us, King taught us, so on. Jesus taught us, the prophets taught us. So that's what I meant.
When they're using like chemicals, and that brings us into that situation. What other method can we do? Talking about like a peaceful approach when they're using chemicals that we don't let them use against their own people.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. What's the question?
I was asking you if there's a peaceful approach to a situation like that, where they're using chemicals that we don't allow them to use on their own people, chemical warfare.
Oh, I think it's horrific. But whether it's chemical weapons or phosphor shells, tipped shells, or whether it's machine guns or M15s, people can't resist when the military force is so overwhelming. And that's what I saw both in South Africa and in the Middle East. The military weaponry that's used against civilians or so-called terrorists is so extreme that it's totally unwise to try and use skyrockets or knives to battle that kind of force. The only hope is a nonviolent approach. Yeah, over here? Here.
So my question is not to players, but like how much through everything you've seen, how do you keep going?
Well, I'm not an optimist, but I'm a person of hope. Partly because of the story I told you in South Africa, but partly because I see people of faith from all the different religious communities, especially the Abrahamic religions, who take the words of their prophets seriously and reach out to the other. I see it every day. It amazes me every time I see it, and that's pertinent to what the man was talking about chemical weapons. I see it when it seems irrational, but I do believe that there's a divine order to things. I do believe the traps people lay, their own feet get caught in. I do believe that when you tell lies, it's going to come back to haunt you. I do believe that people like you rise up, whether individually or with the whole rainbow people, like Desmond Tutu used to talk about, and face directly the counterproductive actions. I see it. And I see it even in Congress with some people who are standing up and saying, wait a minute, there must be a better way than this. So it's part of my faith. It's part of my experience. It's part of the natural order that we can be sure that maybe not in my lifetime, but in yours for sure, some of these problems will be resolved because of people of goodwill. Okay? Yes, over here.
Good morning.
Morning.
As someone that's been an eyewitness to these crises, humanitarian crises, including those of hunger and terror, what do you believe is the disconnect between seeing these events, having them come through the press, and then viewing them here in the Western world? The biggest example I can kind of think of with this is what happened in Rwanda in the mid-90s.
Yeah.
People were being massacred, and yet you would see it on TV and you would go, oh, that desensitized?
I think you've answered the question. I think it's both. You all know the story of the 1938 ship, the St. Louis, that had all the Jewish people on it? What, 400 or 500 people? And they came here looking for, this is pertinent to the present discussion, the present debate too. They came here looking for refuge, to seek asylum. They saw the lights of Miami, and the government turned them away. I think the additional, and half of them died. Not on the ship, but when they returned and were killed. The two things you say are part of it, but I think the other, maybe more deeply troubling one is that it's the question of the other again. They're not us. It'll never happen to us. We can't do everything. We can't take everybody in. There may be some bad people on the boat or on the airplane. So, you know, we can't handle everything. We've got our own problems. So it's a different level of lack of sensitivity. It's a lack of personal engagement, that those are people just like our kids and parents. And when I tried to communicate to people about what's going on in places, the only way I know to do it is to tell stories. Because the human reaction is, this is just too much for me. It's pertinent to this question. I don't have, in my resources, in my community, I can't handle this. I'm barely surviving myself with trouble at home, or the poverty in my own neighborhood, or the race relations that aren't good enough, or whatever.
Do you think the media is at fault for not making
I
it
think,
personal?
well, the media has done a pretty good job showing what happened in the Ethiopian crisis. I mean, I helped fan that flame. I hired Mohammed Amin to go do the filming of that crisis. So if the media is given the tools, they do a pretty good job of reporting it. I do think European media does a better job of talking about some of these difficult political issues that these guys raised than the American media. And in the midst of protests where little kids were being abused by soldiers on war horses, not only in the Middle East but in southern Africa. I mean, armored war horses, men carrying machine guns against little girls marching in the streets. I would go to journalists and say, please film this. Please tell this story. Please let people know at home. And then you name all the networks. I talk to these people. Please let them know what we're seeing. And they'd say to me, there's no point. Because if I don't censor what I put in my reports, the editors will censor it. Because the marketers won't like it. Or certain groups will overreact, and charge us with not telling the truth. That's gotten a lot better. It's gotten a lot better because of the digital world. Because reporting the facts, like somebody asked, the facts you can check the next day. You can see it with your own eyes. You can talk to other people. So that's gotten better in this country. But when I was in the midst of those struggles as a younger person, it was much harder.
So,
And you can get BBC, you could get other international sources to get your news today. Yes, Samir.
So how do you answer somebody saying like, so you're justifying terrorism?
Tell me how I'm justifying it.
By saying like hunger and oppression and
Oh.
occupation and all create terrorists.
No, I'm saying that's the reality, that if we don't deal with it, it fans the flames of terrorism. I want to solve the hunger problem and the water problem and the occupation problem and the chemical weapons problem. I want to address those so there is less terrorism. That's my job as a humanitarian. That's what I'm sworn to do under international humanitarian law. That's the Hippocratic oath I take. Yeah, somebody else? Yes.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds to you that solving all these issues starts off with international relations.
Yeah.
So you don't think that media coverage should also take care of America's issues, but it should focus internationally on those issues before coming into America?
I think they're inextricably bound. I think the two are so close together, we can't separate them. And that's one of the reasons we have to say to our media people, and you guys, if you become media people, don't weary in really working hard to get the facts and get them out, whether it's an international issue or a national issue, because it builds confidence for people then to mobilize at the grassroots. Like we're doing, we got 3 Afghan families in before the ban, just before Christmas and just after the New Year, in my little community. 8 faith communities, 6 Christian churches, and 2 synagogues. We because of what's going on over there, and because the responsibility we have for the war in that area of the world, we took care of those people whose lives were at risk because they had been friends with Americans, because they'd been interpreters for Americans. And they're the most beautiful families. Each one of them has little kids that just make your heart leap. So when you go in and outfit a bare apartment and go like my wife did to the airport and meet those people and bring them to that place, it's bringing the two together. It really is. And the Washington Post has covered it. And the Washington Post covered it when one of those families got caught in the ban. So there you go. And then because of the judge's ruling, they got in the next day and people were rejoicing. And Syrian families are now waiting to get in. So we got to keep at it. What we can do, what each person can do, it makes a big difference. Somebody else that hasn't asked? Yes.
So how do you think the U.S. should respond to the refugee crisis and like the economic issues that it presents by letting people in? And do you think the majority of the work should be done by government or should it be done by private organizations?
He's asking about the refugee crisis and how do we deal with it. Well, the facts show that refugees who come in are amongst the best contributors to our economy. So it's not a big burden on our economy. The State Department only gives us, as people who resettle refugees, and this is private, it's not in my professional, this is just because we're volunteers. They give a small amount of money for the first 3 months, and those people have to pay for their own airfare to get here, and then the sponsoring community, like our 8 churches and 2 synagogues, we have to pay or provide a support system for them to pay the rent the rest of the year while the family is looking for work. And it's amazing to me how quickly those people find jobs. And of course, they take jobs, even if they're engineers or doctors or teachers, they'll take entry-level jobs at grocery stores to feed their own families. So whether it's government or private, it's interlinked again, just like I was saying here. State Department provides the program, does all the vetting, thorough vetting. It can't get any more thorough than it is, to make a point. And then they work through Catholic Relief Services, Jewish Refugee Services, Lutheran World Services, and 2 others, World Relief and 1 other, to make sure these people have their needs met while they're building a life, getting their kids in school, getting their Social Security cards, moving towards citizenship. Some of the most vibrant communities in the Midwest are communities that have had their whole downtowns restored to lively activity because the Ethiopians opened their grocery store, the Somalis opened their restaurant, the Hmong started a nice clothing store for people from Asia, and some of the towns of the Delta could use things like that. Yeah, somebody else that hasn't asked a
There's
question?
one question here and one question here. Go ahead.
Well,
So just to conclude my original question,
Can't hear you.
I can't hear you. Thank you.
just in conclusion of my original question, I was asking exactly, like, if you are in favor of continuing funding for Israel despite it being divided.
I didn't say that. I think it's a bad idea. It's bad for Israel, it's bad for us. It's bad for the rest of the world. Absolutely not. We have got to be equitable in the way we share our resources. Israel doesn't need our resources. They're digging their own hole. If they depend on us, they can take care of themselves.
Exactly what I need to ask the question, just to clarify.
Okay, somebody else? There's one last
Final
question.
question here.
Yes.
I'll try to make it quick. Just to play.
Speak up so the people in the back can hear.
Just to play a little devil's advocate here. I know the biggest humanitarian effort, to go off his point, is the refugees. On one side, it's, I guess, don't take them in. The other side, it's do let them in. I guess the don't take them inside, the argument is, if you don't let them in, see what happens in their country, they continue to suffer. But if you do let them in, as an immigrant myself, you could see like what happened in Germany. They did have a bunch of problems in Germany and France. So how do you find that balance? Because I'll even admit, as an immigrant, it's crazy to just let everybody in.
Well, for one thing, we don't let everybody in.
I mean,
There's a tight vetting.
should you let them stay? Like, you have the UAE with Dubai, one of the richest countries
Yeah.
in the world.
Yeah.
Should they help out as well?
Absolutely. And we've been pressuring them to do that.
But how much is enough? Like,
I don't know how much is enough. We have to do both. And there's the President of the United States, the Congress, nobody disagrees. Nobody in the populace disagrees about the fact that we should let people in. It's how we let them in, how they're vetted. And that's the debate that's going on with the courts right now.
I have one more question. Another argument, I guess, from the Trump side, I guess, is you do have a lot of homeless and
That's right.
single mothers in America.
Yeah.
Should you take care of your own people first rather than...
Same time. That's what I'm arguing. Goes together. If we mobilize to do what we're doing in resettling Afghans, you know what we've discovered? Other people are mobilizing to take care of the street people. It's a time, as I started this discussion, this is a good place to end, it's a time of massive rebuilding of our organizational structures to take care of people in need, both overseas and here. That's what's happening because of the debate that's gone on the last 6 months. It's the greatest I've seen since the 1960s, where people are really getting reorganized to take care of business. Go for it, you guys. Thanks.
That's good.